Good luck, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Hmm. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's RC virtual lecture, The Swift Ones, Hares and Ancient Egyptian Visual Culture. I am Dr. Fatma Ismail, U.S. Director for Outreach and Programs at RC, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, a quick reminder to please keep your microphones muted during the presentation. You're welcome to add questions in the Q&A box or chat, and we will address as many as we can after the talk. I am pleased to have you with us for today's lecture by Dr. Jennifer Babcock. She's a graduate of the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She's a faculty member in the art history departments at Pratt Institute and Fashion Institute of Technology. She also advises graduate students in NYU's visual arts program. Dr. Babcock is the author of Animal Fables in Ancient Egypt, Tree Climbing Hippos, and Ennobled Mice, and co-editor of Rethinking Ancient Egypt, Studies in Honor of Anne Macy Roth. Her scholarship focuses on the ancient Egyptian depictions of animals, the role of animals in ancient Egyptian religion, and the modern reception and interpretation of ancient Egyptian culture. Today's lecture explores a very interesting topic, the significance of the hare in ancient Egyptian visual culture. Although hares were linked with one of Egypt's oldest deities, they rarely appear in art. Our speaker will take us through when and why these depictions occur and what they reveal about ancient perceptions of nature, and how hares were sometimes symbolically intertwined with other desert creatures like wildcats. We will have about 45 minutes for the lecture, followed by 10 to 15 minutes for questions and discussion. I'm sure we're all very excited to learn more about all of this, so please welcome Dr. Jennifer Babcock.
Right, thank you so much, Fatima, for that introduction. And thank you to RC for inviting me to give a talk today about a topic that I'm very interested in and have been working a lot on. I think that it's a very timely topic as well, given how that the Divine Egypt exhibition has just opened at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So if you have a chance to come through New York, I'm sure you would be seeing it, but it's a really wonderful exhibition. And I want to congratulate everyone who worked on that exhibition because it really is such an effective way to show people how the ancient Egyptians visualized and understood their pantheon. So with that said, I'm going to just start by acknowledging the close relationship that the ancient Egyptians had with nature and the animal world. This is something that is abundantly clear when we study ancient Egyptian visual and material culture. And so we find representations of plant life and animal life integrated everywhere in painting and sculpture, small objects, monumental architecture, and even the written language. Observed animal behaviors were also used to explain or draw parallels to show how the world functioned on a cosmic level, and animals were frequently associated with divinities to highlight the gods' supernatural powers. So, for instance, the god Re's association with the falcon is appropriate because of his solar significance and the implication of his celestial domain. In painting and sculpture, we observe how ancient Egyptian artists paid careful attention to naturalistic details in depicting the falcon's facial markings, which are essentially a stylization of the feathered patterns that actual falcons have. They are also associated with the wedgehead eye or the eye of Horus, an Egyptian symbol signifying wholeness and completeness. To give another example, we have Anubis, the god of mummification, who's associated with wild canines. And in fact, the Egyptian jackal is connected to the funerary culture of ancient Egypt because the ancient Egyptians would have seen these creatures roaming the desert near cemeteries. But while the Egyptian jackals were likely there to scavenge for food, the Egyptians understood them to be standing as guardians of their deceased ancestors. So while the ancient Egyptians were keen observers of how wild animals behave, we see that they have also often projected their own assumptions and desires onto these behaviors. As scholars are beginning to pay more attention to the representation of animals in ancient Egypt, we see that there is a little bit of a bias. There's been a focus mainly on looking at large wild mammals, domestic animals, or animals that appear with great frequency in ancient Egyptian art, like cats, and of course also nilotic birds. Indeed, one might assume that the frequency in which an animal is referenced in texts or represented in images and objects might suggest that the ancient Egyptians may have considered some animals more important than others. For instance, most people understand that the ancient Egyptians held cats in high regard, partly because of how frequently they are depicted in ancient Egyptian art and how often they are associated with divinities and divine power. Other animals like bovines, jackals, and baboons are also frequently represented, explicitly indicating their importance to the ancient Egyptians in their daily lives and their spiritual lives. But maybe the animals that are less visible in the art historical record may have been more vital to ancient Egyptian culture than we assume and realize. So hares do not seem to be represented frequently in ancient Egyptian art, at least when we compare it to other animal species. But nonetheless, there's a lot of evidence that they were essential to the ancient Egyptians. And despite this centrality, maybe to ancient Egyptian culture, discussions about hares in Egyptological scholarship is often limited. Usually, there may only be a brief discussion of how they were appreciated for things like their fecundity, which, while true, does not fully consider their other qualities, qualities that the ancient Egyptians may have embraced. A careful study of the nuances of hare representation can provide insight into how hares were connected to significant ancient Egyptian cosmological and religious beliefs. But before we delve into the cultural significance of hares in ancient Egypt, I need to distinguish the difference between hares and rabbits, terms that people often use interchangeably, even in Egyptological scholarship. And the conflation is understandable. On the one hand, they have many similarities. Physically, they both have long ears, a short upturned tail, and similar coloring. Hares and rabbits are also both well known for their ability to reproduce quickly, which is why in pretty much every culture where there are hares and rabbits, which is also pretty much everywhere, they are associated with fertility. But there are many critical differences between hares and rabbits, which is why they are distinct species. For one, hares and rabbits live in different habitats and therefore exhibit different behaviors. Rabbits tend to be more social. They live in more densely vegetative environments and burrow underground. Hares, however, are more solitary and prefer to live in open areas such as fields, prairies, and desert regions where they don't burrow but instead create shallow depressions in the ground for their resting places. Hares and rabbits, therefore, face different environmental dangers, which means that they have adapted differently. Typically, hares are larger and stronger than rabbits, allowing them to run at much higher speeds. They also have much larger ears, allowing them to hear from great distances, and they are precocial, meaning that they are born where they could live independently from their mother if necessary. So while rabbits are born blind and furless, hares are born with full sight and a coat of fur. These differences are important because the hare's specific environment and behaviors influence the way that they are portrayed in mythology, religion, and in visual and material culture. Now, the hares that the ancient Egyptians depicted in their visual culture is specifically the Lepus capensis, which lives in desert and semi-desert regions in the Sahara and other parts of Africa and Western Asia, with some being as far east as modern-day India. Ancient Egyptian artists sometimes represented hares in captivity or in their natural habitat in tomb decoration. They are shown as offerings being carried to the deceased, either as dead animals or sometimes alive in cages. Other times, artists may depict them resting in the shallow depressions that they nest in, or they may be shown running away in a hunt. In these tomb representations, hares are depicted with naturalistic features and behaviors. They are painted with light brown colors or with a flecked fur coat with creamier colored underbellies and tails. Their ears are long, but not necessarily exaggerated, and their facial profiles are depicted with the sloping downward curve. Their movements and bodily positions are also naturalistic. In these tomb representations, hares don't seem to have an explicit cosmological role, but I do want to say that their presence in the tomb, of course, have an underlying symbolism related to rebirth and fecundity, or at least we could say that it has that underlying symbolism. The hare is also an ideogram in the ancient Egyptian written language. The hieroglyph shows the hare in profile, seated in what we could call a sphinx pose, a common resting position for actual hares and rabbits. We see that both ears are upright and visible. The tail is flipped up and in an upward position. And we also see that the details of the hare hieroglyph may be rendered slightly differently depending on who the artist is. Sometimes we have hieroglyphs that are very naturalistic, like what we see in many of the hares depicted in offering scenes and desert landscapes. But we also have some that are much more stylized. And it's this stylization that I'm going to be focusing on because I think that the stylization provides us with greater insight into the divine significance that the hare may have had to the ancient Egyptians. One of the earliest goddesses in the ancient Egyptian pantheon is Hwenet, the goddess of the Hermopolitan hare nome. Even her name is spelled with the hare hieroglyph. Appropriately, Hwenet is known as the Swift One, as the ancient Egyptians would have noted how quickly hares run in the desert. In fact, some hares have been known to run about 45 miles per hour during a sprint. But while hares are sacred to Hwenet, Hwenet is also associated with other animals. Sometimes she appears as a snake or as a woman with the head of the snake. And later on in ancient Egyptian history, she might be depicted with a head of a lioness. So these variations and when it's specific associations with seemingly unrelated animals, such as hares, serpents, and felines, are important to consider as they reveal how the ancient Egyptians perceived connections between animals that may seem unfamiliar or surprising, especially to those of us more accustomed to life in suburban or urban environments. It's also important to note that the hare is associated with another essential ancient Egyptian deity, Osiris, who is also sometimes known as Wenifer. Wenifer is spelled with the hare hieroglyph Wen, which is also used to spell potentially protective verbs, including Wen her, open to sight of or clear vision, Wen I to hasten, hurry, and Wenen to exist. So incidentally, all of these words clearly relate to the natural behaviors and characteristics of hares. Hares have excellent vision. They are able to see almost 360 degrees around them. They're quick and they reproduce easily, which is a quality that one can easily associate with the word existence in general. So it's no wonder then why the hare becomes a popular amuletic form. Now, Williams Flinders Petrie was the first to do a significant study on ancient Egyptian amulet types, categorized the hare amulet as theomorphic, or a divine type, because of the hare's association with Wennefer or Osiris. A second major publication on ancient Egyptian amulets by Carol Andrews provided a slightly different interpretation. She believed that the hare's amuletic power was one of assimilation, meaning that it had transferable qualities to the wearer. In this case, the wearer might adopt a hare's swift movement, alertness, and fecundity. However, realistically, the hare amulet may have been both of these things and more. In his recent book on ancient Egyptian amulets, Joaquin Quack argues that earlier studies have been overly rigid in their attempts to categorize these objects. Given the complexity of ancient Egyptian mythology, which is characterized by overlapping narratives and multiple coexisting truths, it's essential that scholars adopt a more flexible and nuanced approach in interpreting these cultural artifacts. Uncovering additional symbolism of hare amulets remains elusive, given that these are mostly unprovenanced, they have no inscriptions, and they're not explicitly mentioned in religious texts. These characteristics, though, are common to many amulets, not just ones depicting hares, and this explains why our comprehensive understanding of amulets is limited. Scholars have generally avoided studying amulets in detail, privileging other artifacts more closely tied to textual and archaeological evidence instead. Additionally, in many cases, the amulet's small sizes and occasional crudeness in fabrication may result in a reluctance to study them carefully. But the visual design of the hare as a three-dimensional amuletic form gives us another perspective from which to understand the ancient Egyptian interpretation of animal behaviors as it relates to the world view. The earliest form of the hare amulet can be attested as early as the 4th dynasty at Kau and Badari. These were found in a funerary context and are made of various materials, including carnelian, ivory, and feldspar. The hares are shown crouching in a resting position with their ears flying flat against their back or parallel to their back. There are loopholes that are drilled either through the hare's body or attached to one side of the hare's body so that the hare faces to the right. The majority of hare amulets, though, come from the 3rd intermediate period, dating up to the late period. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned, most of these amulets don't have a clear provenance, and they are consistently made. The other thing that they have in common, too, is that they are consistently made with faience, often more green than blue in color. They are shown at rest, again in that sphinx pose, with the forearms of the animal stretched outwards, with the rounded hind legs flat on the floor. The flat bottom of the hares is almost always, if not always, uninscribed. The large ears are laid flat or horizontal to the body, and they are symmetrical with each other. In these later period hare amulets, there's a suspension hole between the ears and the hare's backs. In studying a sample of these amulets, which mostly come from collections in the United States and the UK, I've also noticed that the ears are the most prominent features of the amulets, not only in their size, but also because of the precise parallel incisions depicted in the interior of the ears, represented consistently. Now, in some instances, the hieroglyphic version of the hare features large incised ears. This is a characteristic, again, seen in the amulets. But sometimes an artist may represent hieroglyphic hare signs without these incised lines. So it's unclear if this visual inconsistency is related to a specific location, geographic region, or individual artistic preference. This would have to be something that one studies and another, like maybe in the future. But for now, I can note that the hair amulets more consistently feature incised line work in the ears compared to what we see in these hieroglyphs. Maybe the absence of incised or linear details on the ears suggests that in some of these hieroglyphs, the inner ear is less important, or maybe the artist wanted to focus on other hair features. So going back to the tomb scenes, if we look at the desert and hunting scenes, we see that the inner incised ear decoration is less common. And this may have been because the artist was more focused on conveying the hare's movement and behavior. The incised lines are not unique to hair depictions. In fact, they are used frequently in rendering the interior of animal ears in ancient Egyptian art. The incised lines might be a way to indicate shading or different coloring, but it's also possible that the parallel lines are a schematic way of rendering the tiny blood vessels that are visible when these animals' ears are backlit. Why the ancient Egyptians would choose to render the interior of an ear in a way that at times betrays what is otherwise a very naturalistic image is unclear. But with that said, Linda Evans, who is a scholar who has also done a lot of work on the representation of animals, she's noted many examples in which ancient Egyptian artists have deviated from naturalism, despite the fact that animal representation has the reputation for being particularly naturalistic. So part of the reason for this deviation was to ensure that some animal forms maintained consistency to the so-called artistic canon and mode of representation in ancient Egyptian art. In other words, animal forms were dictated by artistic conventions. For instance, specific representations of behaviors were represented as standardized motifs that must adhere to the canon of ancient Egyptian art, which sometimes resulted in biologically inaccurate depictions. Evans has noted many such examples in representations of other species. So in these depictions of papyrus thickets, predators seem to be climbing up papyrus stalks, even though behavioral studies of such animals indicate that they do not do this. It's more likely that the ancient Egyptian artist was attempting to show them walking through the papyrus instead. And to cite another example, sometimes a male animal might show itself rearing behind a standing female to represent the act of mating, regardless of species-specific differences. Evans clarifies that this is not the result of a mistake or an observational misunderstanding, but it's because the artist was conforming to a standard of representing a recognizable animal behavior. Thus, the schematic treatment of the inner ear of animals may be nothing more than a way to differentiate between the closed and open ear. So to clarify, a closed ear references depictions of ears that are turned downward or behind the animal. An open ear references an ear that is turned outward to evoke the animal scanning the environment for sounds. In two-dimensional ancient Egyptian art, an artist would paint the closed ears to show the fur of the backside of the ear. An open ear, however, would be painted with fleshy tones or with the inner linear design. So in two-dimensional representations, one ear may be shown with the inner ear facing the viewer. In contrast, the other ear, the ear that's understood to be further away, shows its fur-covered backside. This rendering allows an ancient Egyptian artist to depict the hair as completely as possible, according to the ancient Egyptian artistic canon. However, in 3 dimensions, which includes most of the third intermediate period and late period hair amulets, the exterior of the ears is not usually highlighted or depicted at all. In most cases, the 2 ears are shown side by side with the incised inner lines. In other words, the ears are shown flipped upward, perhaps suggesting that we are to understand them facing forward and erect. So in life, hares and rabbits typically rest with their ears laid back along their bodies, a posture that signals relaxation rather than alertness. In contrast, the inner ears are obvious only when the animal is upright and its ears are facing forward, an orientation associated with heightened attention or readiness. Clearly showing the open ear is important when rendering the hare as an amulet. And this is the behavior that I think that was most important for the artist to be able to highlight explicitly. Coincidentally, also, the open ear complements Quack's point about the hare symbol being used in the word for openness of sight and openness in general. Because with excellent hearing and vision, the hare can detect any potential dangers and fight or flee when necessary. In previous scholarships about the hare, and specifically about hare amulets, people have commented on the hare's associations with fertility and rebirth. And indeed, the ability for hares to reproduce quickly and in large numbers is an observable fact. It's a quality that would have been desirable for any dead Egyptian, given that the funerary culture focuses so much on this theme. But what's interesting is that fecundity is not explicitly depicted, even if we may iconographically associate hares with this characteristic. Now, another behavior attributed to the hare is its swiftness, which again is not something that is clearly conveyed by the stillness of the hare's crouching position in these amuletic representations. But the hares do clearly illustrate the hare's sharp senses by highlighting the size of the ears and unequivocally depicting both ears as open. The design of these amulets emphasizes the hare's ability to hear things from distant places. Such a quality would be invaluable to someone traveling through the afterlife, having to face many dangerous entities such as slithering snakes. And here we have illustrations of hare deities controlling snakes in the books of the dead, and this correlates well with this theory and may indicate that the ancient Egyptians recognized the hare's ability to protect actively rather than reactively. Now, highlighting certain animal features to avoid representational ambiguities is something that the ancient Egyptians commonly did. Evans, again, notice how ancient Egyptian artists have emphasized and standardized certain features to make their identification really clear. So, for instance, she notes that in some contexts, representations of crested porcupine quills are rendered in ways to highlight its arrangement on the backside of the body and the paddle-shaped tail. And sometimes this leads to confusion. Some scholars have mistaken images of the porcupine for a hybrid animal, specifically a mixture between an ibex and a fish. But Evans has demonstrated that the striated tails of the animals are not fish tails, but is the porcupine tail tilted and depicted upward, which follows the ancient Egyptian conventions of two-dimensional representations. The long legs that we see on the left might be misinterpreted as a caprid, but Evans notes that they are unhooved, which is noteworthy since hooves are consistently represented in caprids. So Evans concluded that this animal shown here on the left is not a composite, but an example of certain features being rendered unnaturalistically to conform to ancient Egyptian representational rules. So again, one of the most interesting features of the hare amulet is that the ears are both shown open, despite lying flat on the backside of the hare as if it were at rest. The horizontally oriented ear position is likely designed to give the amuletic form sturdiness. A vertical ear position would make the amulet vulnerable to damage, and then to have a structural support that would connect the ears to the backside of the hare would be really unattractive. So unlike the hare hieroglyphic sign where the ears are shown slightly askew so that both ears are visible, in these amulets, the ears are parallel to one another. And part of this decision was maybe aesthetic, but it was also probably to suggest that the ears are meant to be, or we're to understand the ears as being erect and facing forward, as if they're scanning for potential danger. Now, when I first looked at the inner ears of the hares, I had initially thought that the inner ears were purposely designed to evoke um, these reed hieroglyphs, which are often featured on offering tables. So I wondered if these were a reference to the fields of Yaru or the afterlife. Initially or eventually dismissed this idea once I realized how many animals have inner ears depicted with these parallel striped lines. But I was talking to Ekaterina Barbash at the British Museum, or sorry, the Brooklyn Museum, who had brought my attention to the fact that the ears of some cat statuary, at least in the images of divine cats, seem to evoke the ma'at feather. And so one of the clearest examples of this is the Geyer Anderson cat, which is in the British Museum. If you look carefully, you'll see that the inner ear is shaped very much like a mat feather. And Barbash suggests that this detail, along with the scarab, is often depicted between the ears of cat statues, is meant to evoke the animal's relationship with divine myth. And so if the hair amulets are typically associated with funerary contexts, perhaps the incisions are not only mimetic of blood vessels, but maybe they are also symbolic as well. Another feature that I found striking about hair amulets, but also the hieroglyph, is how the treatment of the body is rendered in ways that draw comparisons to desert felines. Note, for instance, how in some hieroglyphs and the amulets, the musculature is well defined and the rib cage is prominent. Such features are not apparent in observations of actual Cape hares, so this musculature seems like an odd detail to include or to emphasize. But the treatment of the body is really similar to what we see in depictions of recumbent large cats and sphinxes, which brings me to another interesting possibility about the design of the hair amulets. Now, the combination of hair and feline forms is something that I have noted in one representation of the motif of the great tomcat, which is a manifestation of the eye of the solar god Ra. And this tomcat is believed to be based on the serval cat, shown here on the right. This motif is found on several books of the dead papyri and also a total of 8 tombs at Deir el-Medina. And altogether, we're looking at this image, this motif, dating from the New Kingdom up until the Ptolemaic period. Now, the earliest representations of the great tomcat from the Deir el-Medina necropolis come from Peshedu, Senedjim, and Amenemopet's tombs, which date between the reigns of Seti I and Ramses II. Subsequently, we find this motif in Nakhtamun's tomb and Pembui and Kanza's tomb, which date firmly to the reign of Ramses II. The motif appears again in Neferhotep II's tomb, which dates between the reigns of Ramses II and Seti II. And then we have Inarkou's tomb, dating to the reign of between the reigns of Ramses III and Ramses IV. And it is the last tomb from Deir el-Medina that includes this great tomcat motif. Now I'm showing you the Inarkou's great tomcat on the right, and you see it is different and quite unique from the other representations of the great tomcat and other tombs at Deir el-Medina because of the length of the ears. The artist responsible for this motif, a man named Hormin, signed his work, which might suggest he was particularly proud of his artistic creativity and abilities. Many scholars have talked about the long ears in passing, sometimes assuming that this is an idiosyncratic artistic detail. Others have supported the possibility that they are just simply an exaggeration of the serval cat's large pointed ears. And then yet another alternative reading is that Horman's treatment of the motif indicates a deliberate visual hybridization of two animals. So Valérie Angenot, in her work on the use of rebuses in ancient Egyptian art, investigated the possibility that Horman's version of the great tomcat is a hybrid between a feline and a donkey. According to Angenot, the cat or Miu, combined with the ears of the donkey, which is called A'a in Egyptian, results in Miu A'a, which can be read as cat donkey, but it also, Miu A'a also means the great tomcat. So the rebus is a visual pun that adequately explains why the ears are so long and may be an additional level of interpretation that Hormin intended. Now, I am promoting an understanding of this motif as representing a merging of hare and feline forms, but I want to be clear that I'm not rejecting Angeno's reading. As we have seen, the ancient Egyptians often layered multiple meanings onto their images, and I think it's possible that Harmin may have intended for ambiguity in representing this zoomorphic hybrid. So there are various shared physiological and external features of hare and serval cat that make this hybridity seem seamless in visual representations. For one, both have tawny colored coats, and the darker spots of the serval can easily be conflated with the agouti colored speckled coat of the desert hare. The underbelly and the chest area are often a white or creamy color in both animals. Secondly, the length of the serval cat ears is exceptionally long, aspiring to reach the length of a hare's ears. Additionally, both animals have very long front legs with muscular hind legs, which means that their silhouettes are almost identical when they are sitting up and also striding. And when they are at rest, serval cats and Cape hares both place their weight on their hind legs with the paws tucked under the body. The profiles of servals and hares are also very much alike. They both have small yet pointed snouts, and the overall shape of the nose and nostrils are superficially similar. While careful examination of photographs of serval cats and Cape hares makes their physical differences apparent, many of the features are practically interchangeable when looking at ancient Egyptian artistic representations. So in the image of the great tomcat in Senedjim's tomb, and also in many detailed hieroglyphs of the Cape hare, the patterning of their coats is nearly identical. We see they're golden in color, often with brown flecks and spots, with a white or creamy underbelly. The great tomcat and hares are all shown with large hind legs and long forearms. The profile of the face is also relatively the same shape and include the scruffy texture of the fur around the cheeks. The main distinction between representations of Senedjim's great tomcat and the hare hieroglyph really lies in the length and shape of the ear, with the tomcat's ears being slightly pointier compared to the more rounded ears of the Cape hare. And of course, one is longer than the other. But when we compare a typical hieroglyph with that of Intercal's great tomcat illustration, we see that the emphasis and the similarities in their respective ear shape and length are more apparent. So Hormin's representation of the great tomcat depicts the ears with a similar degree of pointiness and length. So we see that Hormin's tomcat's ears are not as proportionally long as the ears of actual and also represented Cape hares, but nonetheless, they are significantly longer than what one would expect in a serval cat and also representations of serval cats. They are about a third of the length of the body. Sidney Alfrere recognized the mythological relationship between hares and felines in ancient Egyptian texts and assumed that the ancient Egyptians would have recognized the physiological similarities between these animals. He also noticed how hares and felines are sometimes interchangeable in ancient Egyptian funerary texts. For instance, in one vignette from Horror's Book of the Dead, which is now at the British Museum, the deceased is shown addressing a group of three divinities. One has a head of a hare, the second a head of a serpent, and the third that of a bovine. This is a traditional image that is found in other Book of the Dead papyri, but sometimes these details can be modified, as seen in the papyrus Greenfield, which is also at the British Museum. In this example, the hare-headed deity has been replaced with a feline one. This mixing or hybridization of hares and servals would explain why these animals are interchangeable in Book of the Dead motifs, while also providing additional context to spell 17, which is often written adjacent to depictions of the great tomcat. Well, Frere argues that the foundation of this hybridity may be related to astronomical observations of lunar splashes, the shapes of the darker parts of the moon visible to us, and the observed natural behaviors of felines and hares. He says that given the morphological or the similar morphological profile of rabbits and hares and felines, that some Egyptians would have seen a lunar cat instead of, or maybe in addition to, a lunar hare. Now, spell 17 specifically references the solar eye of Ra, but it is also important to remember that there is another eye, the lunar eye of Horus. So together, these are the eyes of the heavens, and many textual and visual representations show the solar and lunar eye being blurred and conflated. So the goddess Wennet provides additional evidence that felines and hares are closely intertwined. So her possible prehistoric form as a snake is likely rooted in the Hermopolitan creation myth in which the god Thoth, who has lunar connotations, created the Ogdoad, the chthonic origins of the world. The meaning of her name, again, is the swift one, and this, of course, characterizes the rapid movements of snakes, hares, and wild felines. And the ancient Egyptians would have surely recognized these shared behavioral similarities. Furthermore, while the serval cat is associated with a solar deity, the hare's likely connection to the moon suggests that the Hormin's great tomcat merges Hermopolitan and Heliopolitan iconography, so blending solar and lunar imagery. This fusion of forms symbolizes the completeness of the 24-hour day and the dual aspects of the supreme cosmic deity's two eyes. Now, as a prey animal, the hare may not seem like the most obvious choice to merge with a powerful and violent image of Re slaughtering a serpent. The hares have powerful offensive and defensive characteristics and behaviors that make this hybridization appropriate for this motif. So as I already noted, servals and hares are incredibly fast runners and have large ears, allowing them to detect movement and other creatures from afar. Both animals also have excellent night vision, but the hare is also equipped with the ability to sleep with its eyes open, which makes them able to attack and counterattack a threat more quickly. So despite their commonly held reputation for meekness and timidity, rabbits and hares both display formidable combat skills. And this is a reason, and there is a reason why their ferocity is highlighted in so much literary, visual materials, and also popular cultural throughout history, such as the 1972 novel Watership Down, or in European medieval manuscript marginalia depicting hares and rabbits battling knights. And again, to return to an Egyptian example, we have this third intermediate period papyrus, which includes a vignette that depicts male and female hare-headed deities handling a large snake. Now, these images are supernatural and or fantastic, but they are based on actual behaviors of hares and rabbits that people throughout history have observed. Rabbits and hares are known to chase away and sometimes kill serpents successfully. I have here two clips from newspapers that were clipped rather recently of wild rabbits battling a snake. And I'm also going to show you a quick video that was taken a couple of years ago and posted onto YouTube.
The traffic came to a standstill in South Carolina as drivers watched the battle between a snake and a bunny.
There's a bunny fighting a snake.
Wait, why is the bunny winning? The tussle had traffic completely stopped as drivers watched this tense battle. After a few minutes, the snake slithered away into the woods, and the bunny still hopped after it.
Yeah, it's surprising to see the bunny. It looks like he's trying to eat him.
Yeah, it does look like that. So really, is the bunny the predator and all?
Yeah.
Wow.
Or maybe he's trying to protect his babies or her babies.
He wants a little piece of that.
Yeah.
That's a small. He's hungry. Huh.
Okay.
The traffic came to a stand.
So additionally, I would like to point out that felines and cats and rabbits, or sorry, rabbits and hares are also nocturnal and crepuscular, which means they are most active at night and during twilight. So it's not difficult to imagine an ancient Egyptian observing the behaviors of these animals in dim lighting, and to understand that sometimes maybe that an ancient Egyptian would confuse the two because of their similar coloring and silhouettes. So the conflation of animals in the great tomcat motif is unique to Invercow's tomb. It's the most recent of the Spell 17 motifs from Daryl Medina's necropolis, so it may represent an iconographical shift where cats and hares become increasingly intermixed and merged. Overall, though, Invercow's tomb in general reflects especially rare texts, imagery, and artistic details. To give some examples of this, we know that we see that the tomb ceiling displays some uncommon decorative patterns. Horman also throughout Invercow's tomb, we also see him with a slight stubble on his chin rather than being clean shaven, which is what we would expect to see. We have this rare motif of Invercow seated on a boat on a bark and posed in a very unusual way where he is wrapping a piece of linen around his shoulders. And furthermore, directly below the great tomcat, we have a rare treatment of the blind harper motif, here depicted with squinted eyes and an open mouth to indicate singing, details that break away from the ancient Egyptian canon of representation. Now, Horman's artistic creativity in illustrating the Spell 17 motif specifically is evidenced not only by his visual hybridization of the serval and hare, but also by the overall arrangement of the motif's elements. The two loops of the serpent conjure the desert hills, while between the loops is the Ishad tree of Heliopolis, which has solar connotations. And compositionally, the placement of the tree between the serpent's loops essentially forms the Achet hieroglyph, further reinforcing the great tomcat's triumph over the snake, commonly interpreted as Apophis. All of these layers of meaning were likely accepted and embraced by the ancient Egyptians, who were open to including old and new mythologies in their religious artwork. In the case of the great tomcat, the merging of Heliopolitan and Hermopolitan mythologies is expressed through hybridizing the images of serval and hare. The fusion of animal forms not only symbolizes the blending of their inherent behaviors, but also results in a formidable and multifaceted divine entity. Horman's creative rendering of the great tomcat symbolizes the sun and the moon with the two eyes of the heavens, according to ancient Egyptian cosmology. The subtle merging of two animals to the point where it's hard to distinguish between them is not unique to these amulets or Invercow's great cat motif. We also see this with other animals. So to provide an example, Linda Evans, in her study of dragonfly representations, observed that the composite of flying insects depicted in elite tombs of the late 5th and 6th dynasties are a composite of morphologically similar aquatic species. This interpretation would explain inconsistencies and the length of the antenna, the body, and the wing shape as they were depicted. And in her words, she believes that this is a motif that shows an amalgamation of aquatic insect features. She also has demonstrated that the hieroglyph that we call the bee motif is actually not just a bee, but is essentially a composite of insects to illustrate a type of insect, specifically a stinging insect. So rather than just a distinct species. Thus, one may ask if the specific treatment of the hare in some imagery may be intentionally blurring animal forms to categorize desert and grassland creatures together and to emphasize their essential roles in the afterlife. Perhaps many hare amulets are stressing the hare's role as a protector and guardian, even more than serving as a symbol of fecundity. In the case of Invercow's tomb image, we see cat and hare merged as a possible representation of heavenly spheres, sun and moon respectively. A full appreciation of the stylistic and artistic considerations of hare imagery brings additional insights into the nuanced ways that the ancient Egyptian artists may have communicated religious and practical ideas. Subtle decisions to blend animal forms or exaggerate certain features shows that the ancient Egyptians were not just concerned with mimetic representation, but with conveying information about species-specific and shared species behaviors and how they function in the broader scope of the cosmos. So I want to thank you all for your attention. I think we have time for questions or any comments. Also, you can reach out to me too. That's my email there. If you don't have a question right now, but think of a question later, really happy to answer. And thank you again so much for having me.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, Dr. Babcock. It's always exciting to see a topic that blends animal behavior, art, and belief system so thoughtfully. Let's move into the Q&A portion. You're welcome to type your questions in the chat or Q&A box, and I'll read them out loud for the speaker. To get us started, I have a few questions of my own. You suggested that hares might have been intentionally conflated with other desert animals like wildcats. What do you think might tell us about this might tell us about Egyptian views of the desert environment, or how did the ancient Egyptians navigate the boundary between the cultivated Nile Valley and the wilderness beyond it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that I want to think about a bit more. But I think, there's this idea that there's a difference between the animals that are in the desert and then the animals that are in the cultivated area of the Nile, like just kind of similar to how Egyptians differentiate between, the wild animals and domestic animals. And I think like when you look at hares and wild felines, they kind of are skirting like this edge, like this intermediary region where they're getting a little bit close to where people might be, but they're still far enough in the desert. And so I'm wondering if this is like other layers of categorization. But I think what we're also seeing is that they're making sense of these animals in the wild. Um, and yeah, and this is one of the reasons why I think that um, that we're seeing this conflation with these two animals in particular, because they're very like as I've been saying, they're very similar in many ways. I mean, one of the things I didn't say is that they're actually similar in size. Hares are pretty big. Like I think we think of rabbits and hares as being quite small, but they're actually quite large, and and demonstrate a lot of similarities in behaviors. I hope that answers your question a little.
Yeah, definitely. Do you plan to include other desert animals and study them, maybe gazelles or foxes or
Yeah, I would like to. I mean, another thing that I'm really interested in and that I've noticed too, which I think might be representing a different kind of relationship, but hares and hedgehogs are often together, and then like that's another pattern that we see. But hedgehogs aren't associated with wild felines, so I think the hedgehog and the hare is emphasizing another shared behavior and characteristic that we don't see between hares and rabbits. But likely that relationship probably does have more to do with like fertility and so on. But I think I have to do more research on hedgehogs to find out more about their specific behaviors.
Okay, excellent. You have so many comments in the chat about how great your talk is. So,
Thank you.
we have questions, and I think you answered that in the beginning about the difference between rabbits and hares, but we definitely don't have any evidence for rabbits in ancient Egypt, correct?
No, no
Okay.
rabbits. Yeah, I think I should look into when rabbits come into Egypt, because obviously we have rabbits in Egypt today, but they're there domesticated. And yeah, they're clearly rabbits and not domesticated hares, which every once in a while you might see a hare that
Mm,
a little domestic, but yeah, not naturally occurring in the wild,
yeah.
as I know.
I think the earliest I read about rabbits coming into Egypt was Roman times.
Yeah, that makes
But,
sense. Yeah.
um, so
Does-
that answers the first three questions from Patricia and an anonymous attendee about rabbits and if they had hieroglyphic sign for rabbits. But since they didn't have them, they didn't have the even in Roman period, they would use just the same sign, the when in
Mm,
Gardner list of 30 E34 for rabbits as a hieroglyphic
mhm.
name for that. Another question from Amy Calvert. Fascinating talk. Do you think the large ears of the hares depicted in amulets, especially, um, may add to their protective aspect as a sort of non-royal sphinx, given their added ability to hear and perhaps convey messages with their swiftness?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a huge part of it. Again, when you look at a lot of scholarship about hares, they really focus on the fertility and
Mm,
nothing else. I think because a lot of people underestimate hares and rabbits and don't really think about how they've been adapted to um, essentially protect themselves and also other people, other hares. But yeah, I absolutely think that the ears add to their role as a sort of guardian type of figure.
okay, thank you. Another question here. Some hieroglyph sphinx representation and profile have the N or water hieroglyph below or above. What does this represent?
So the water hieroglyph, when you see it below, it probably means, and it would depend, you need to see the full hieroglyphic text,
Mm,
but usually it would be it's not symbolic, but it's part of the word or the verb, right? So like you have the verb wenen, and so then that's why you would see it, the hieroglyph, the water hieroglyph, written right below that. Same with like wenenefer. So you would have the water hieroglyph there. And in fact, like when I'm thinking about all of I mean, just the hieroglyph hair is the when sound, and so sometimes you might have that extra water hieroglyph there to emphasize or to make it very clear that it's supposed to be pronounced that way. So really it's a matter of clarification and spelling rather than having any symbolic significance.
Okay, another question. The conflation is especially fascinating because of the one extreme difference. They are a prey animal and a carnivore. Have you come across any depictions of a cat attacking a hare?
No, I have not found anything like that yet. Although I will be on the lookout, I guess. Usually you see them running away, or sitting still in these naturalistic depictions. And the closest you see, to them like attacking is when they have that merged image in Innerkau's tomb. So like the
Hmm.
problem with this evidence, of course, is that you only really have this one clear piece, but also when you look at books of the dead, of course, you have like hares being, quite predatory actually, like in the Metz papyrus, where you have the hare demons who are holding onto the snake. But also if you look at a lot of books of the dead, you may see little guardian hares with knife blades on them. Um, I will say that I have seen in real life hares and rabbits like attacking cats sometimes. Not that you always see that. It depends on the hare or the rabbit. They're just like people in a sense where everyone has their own personality.
Hmm. Thank you. Let me see in the chat box if there's any more questions here. I can.
See, oh, would there be a difference between cultivated areas and desert areas that would show different iconography. I see that. I mean, yeah, you do have different iconography when you're looking at depictions of, you know, desert wild environments compared to you know, the cultivated land, just because you have different kinds of animals that are there, and you know, the activities that an Egyptian would consider typical of, you know, these different regions would also be different. So yeah, absolutely different, you know, kinds of iconography and image and color palette as well, if you wanted to go that deep into the visual analysis.
Okay, I don't see any questions in the Q&A box, but I'll go quickly in the chat box. There are many compliments for you, Jennifer. So,
Thank you.
I guess there's no more question. It's almost 3 o'clock, so maybe we can end it here by thanking you again so much, Dr. Babcock, for your great presentation. I want to remind our members that the call for papers has been opened for the RC annual meeting in Denver, Colorado, April 10th to the 12th. The submission deadline is December 12th. And also note that the program for the other RC conference, the Cross-Cultural Interaction in Egypt Through the Ages, has been published. The conference will take place in Cairo, December 5th to the 7th. The links to these two conferences are in the chat box. We look forward to seeing many of you then. And thank you again, Professor Babcock, and all of you for sharing part of your weekend with us. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.